Good evening, and welcome to the finale of our 2024 Social Justice Speaker Series here at the Dayton Metro Library, where I proudly serve as your Chief Diversity Officer. The Dayton Metro Library Social Justice Speaker Series is an ongoing initiative that brings some of the world's most prominent authors, creatives, scholars, activists, and practitioners to Montgomery County. At the library, cultivating spaces for courageous conversations and intergroup dialogue where everyone is free to belong is core to our values of equity, diversity, and inclusion. The Social Justice Speaker Series places an emphasis on supporting diverse groups and change agents that come from diverse backgrounds that have been systematically marginalized from the literary canon, publishing industry, cultural and creative scenes, dominant discourses, and beyond. And now, to introduce this evening's speaker. Jenara Nerenberg is the author of the acclaimed book, Divergent Mind, which was hailed by Library's Journal as extraordinary, jaw-dropping, and endorsed by New York Times bestselling authors Susan Cain, Elaine Aron, Stephen Silberman, Robert Whitaker, and many others, and her book has been translated into multiple foreign languages around the world. She is an award-winning writer and producer and named as Brave New Ideas Speaker by the Aspen Institute and graduated from the Harvard School of Public Health and UC Berkeley with advanced degrees in public health and race relations. Jenara is the creator of the Neurodiversity Project and Interracial Project. And now, without further ado, please help me give a warm Montgomery County welcome to our speaker tonight, Jenara Nerenberg.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it and would love to know a little bit about you all. How many of you are originally from Ohio? Okay, the majority. So how many of you are from out of state then? Okay, decent. Well, I just flew in from California, actually, so it's a very different bubble, and I'm so thrilled to be here. It's such a beautiful state, very diverse in every possible way, so I'm really thrilled to see that. And I've got another question. How many of you are familiar with this term neurodiversity? Okay, most of you all. So how many are not? Okay, just a couple. Great. Well, we have a lot to get into. I am a journalist. I'm not a therapist. And sometimes people confuse me for being a therapist because I actually write about psychology a lot. I also come from a family of therapists, so that world is very familiar to me. This is the book, Divergent Mind. It came out in March of 2020, if you can believe it. An interesting time. And so I want to talk to you a little bit today about the research that went into this book. Neurodiversity has definitely become more of a buzzword now, almost 5 years later. At the time, it was, definitely some people had heard of this term and were aware of this new philosophical movement. But it was sort of a new thing to put out there in a more mainstream way in this book. And as a journalist, I do, a fair amount of storytelling. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a physician. And as a journalist, my job is really to talk to people, to listen to people, hear your stories. And that's what fascinates me, and that's what went into this book, and that's what I'd like to share with you all today. And so to begin, we actually have to look at a little bit of history, to be honest. So I want to take you back in time a little bit. The mental health field, more broadly, is a very interesting space to look at. And while the conversations today in social media have created a very different climate for talking about mental health, if you imagine yourself 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and then going way back in time, maybe thinking about how you've seen the world portrayed in films or in some very old books. The way people conceived of the mind and human behavior and the brain was very often through the lens of, religion or spirits, evil spirits, good spirits, and things like this. The way of thinking about any kind of difference, for example, was pretty much always in the realm of normal and abnormal, or good or bad. And so we kind of have to remind ourselves of this, because that's not really the climate we live in today, for the most part. So, the 1700s, 1800s, in the Western context, okay? So as people are leaving Europe for the United States, the field of medicine, the sciences were really rapidly growing. And there was a lot of prestige attached to being a scientist, being able to take a human body, look at organs, break things apart like a clock, like some kind of machine. And that was how people saw the human brain. And so it either worked or it didn't work. Or there was a physical part of the brain that wasn't working, and so you need to remove it, as in the case of lobotomies. And so this was often, the medical fields were very focused on the functions of the body. Now, there was a small contingent of people who said, well, we also want to think about the brain, the mind, and behavior. And so in order for psychology, which it was not called at the time, in order for this to be taken seriously, it had to be sort of categorized as a physical thing. It had to be taken under the wing of science in order to be taken seriously, in order for a theory about the mind to have any kind of prestige. So the field of psychology and psychiatry had to fight very hard to be taken seriously as like a real science. And so with that came very reductionist ideas about what it meant to be okay, what it meant to be normal. And so historically, any expression of difference or divergence was immediately labeled as bad, wrong, evil. So very, very common sense, understandable things. In the case of, for example, people here who were enslaved and people who expressed a desire for freedom were immediately given a label of some kind of mental illness. Women who wanted to work outside the home were also labeled mentally ill. So just to give you a sense of how historically people have been so quick to label as good or bad or right or wrong. I'm going to read a brief passage that just summarizes some of this. Psychology and psychiatry, as we know them today, had to fight hard to become respected disciplines, and they didn't become so until they were firmly accepted and entrenched within the practice of medicine and science more broadly, as ideas regarding madness, insanity, and disorder were slowly evolving. Many practitioners were viewed as quacks. Scientists from other fields developed tools to examine body parts and physical disease, and the same approaches were attempted with the brain and human behavior. The development of psychology and psychiatry thus evolved as science as a whole evolved. But human behavior, desires, beliefs, and thoughts are harder to probe, so the two fields took longer to develop. North America's first medical college was established in 1765 in Philadelphia, signaling the arrival of medicine and medical studies as scientific. But doctors were still treating insane patients through bleeding, a way of purging and fixing so-called irregular blood circulation. Drowning therapy was also popular at the time, as was making patients extremely dizzy by spinning them around and around. The increased medicalization of challenges affecting the brain and behavior meant that less and less attention was being given to how broader sociological and historical contexts would affect people's emotions and mental states. During the late 1700s, there had been a short-lived wave of what was called moral treatment, where people who were deemed insane were treated slightly better and lived in quarters with gardens and areas devoted to the practice of art. A man by the name of Philippe Pinel in France was the primary force behind this approach, and soon after, the Quakers in North America were experimenting with similar approaches. But when these centers started to be influenced by medical professionals, the focus on moral treatment lessened, and a hybrid approach combining medicine and moral treatment began to take hold. Physicians began to manage these centers and in turn medicalize interactions with patients, as opposed to relying on more gentle human dynamics that brought out balance in the individual. As Robert Whitaker writes in Mad in America, as physicians gained control of the asylums, they also constructed a new explanation for the success of moral treatment, one that put it back into the realm of a physical disorder. Pinel's non-organic theory would not do. If it were not a physical ailment, then doctors would not have a special claim for treating the insane. Organizing activities, treating people with kindness, drawing warm baths for the ill, these were not tasks that required the special skills of a physician. Beyond the influence of medicine, larger contextual forces were underestimated as well. Much of what became known as madness, especially in women, cemented around the time of the acceleration of capitalism in Western Europe. If context determines normal and abnormal, then it makes sense to give greater attention to broader historical, economic, and societal forces at work. So, that's just a quick snapshot of some of the history of how, in Western contexts, we have thought of the brain, the mind, human behavior, what counts as normal, what counts as abnormal. And I want to give that snapshot because people who are familiar with the neurodiversity framework, this truly feels like ancient history. It's important to understand the sort of overarching umbrella of how people have thought about the mind throughout time in order to understand how far we've come and in order to understand how radical and revolutionary something like the concept of neurodiversity is. So, I grew up in the 90s in San Francisco, California, and I always could tell something was up. I seemed to be a bit more sensitive. I was more, I would say, like intense, and never had any kind of label. Came from a very open-minded family, very supportive school environments and that kind of thing. But I could tell that there were ways in which I processed the world and thought about the world that seemed to be pretty different from my peers or what I saw in movies and that kind of thing. And it wasn't until I got a little older, in college, and beyond college, and you'll hear this from so many people who are, familiar with this field and for whom these stories resonate. I was sort of like an academically gifted kid. I got straight A's. I left college at 16. I went to UC Berkeley. I went to Harvard. I became a journalist for CNN, Fast Company, Time, like all these different places. And so I had all these, accomplishments, right? Credentials. And it turned out I was really, really good at hyper-focusing. And I was so good at excelling at the things that I was super into and that captivated me and that put me into a kind of flow state. And then, you can't survive that way. You just can't. You've got to switch tasks. Your executive functioning has to light up. So getting married, starting a family, all these things, the laundry, the dishes, making sure you sleep enough, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. My life started getting very confusing because I couldn't really reconcile, accomplishments over here, not knowing how to do X, Y, and Z over here. Around the same time, I started seeing a lot of articles popping up on my feed about how autism and ADHD were being so underdiagnosed in women. And I actually never went any kind of official diagnosis route. Instead, what I did was I went on this huge investigative journey as a journalist, and I decided to write this book. So I interviewed doctors, I interviewed other women, and started to realize essentially that there were a lot of other women out there like me who were sensitive, who got by in school and things like this. Some had official diagnoses, some didn't, but it was very healing and validating to know that there were names for these things. And so that kind of set me on this journey. That's how this book was born. And I basically decided to look at this trait of sensitivity as a sort of a uniting thread. So to now introduce the concept of neurodiversity. So you've heard about this history. I've shared a bit about my own life. And then in the 90s, this term neurodiversity started popping up among a couple of psychologists and theorists. It really started gaining popularity about, I would say, after 2010. I independently started thinking about something I was calling temperament diversity and temperament rights. And I write about it in the book how when I was trying to figure all this stuff out, I was Googling, I was like, is anyone talking about this sort of like diversity of our inner lives? And I came across this term, neurodiversity, and it turns out one of the guys who was one of the main proponents, Nick Walker, was my neighbor, and I recognized his face. So we were on these like parallel journeys. I passed him almost every day on the street, so I knew exactly who I was looking at. So I was like, oh, cool, yeah, neurodiversity, like this makes sense. And so basically what neurodiversity is exactly what it sounds like. It's neurological diversity, right? We acknowledge biodiversity, diversity of skin color, like so many different realms, right? And it makes sense when you stop and think about it. Yeah, like everyone's brain kind of works differently. That makes sense. Why do we have to think in terms of normal and abnormal, right? But this is like a huge departure. This is a huge departure. At the same time, it makes so much sense. It sounds like common sense. So, with the acceleration of social media, and this term has really sort of like caught on. It's almost mainstream. Almost every company has like some kind of neurodiversity committee. So the idea is really to look at the human mind, not in terms of normal and abnormal, to really acknowledge that there is diversity of wiring, diversity of makeup, and there's so many different inputs that would shape how my mind works differently than you all, of course. So there is, a movement around this. It's very popular with teachers, educators, clinicians, therapists, social workers. And it's been amazing to see it grow. I think there's also a little bit of concern, to be honest. I think because now this term is used so often, some people think it's only a synonym for autism and ADHD. So I constantly have to remind people that it's a huge umbrella. There are people with bipolar or schizophrenia, like we all fit under this umbrella, right? In the book, I interviewed a very famous professor in Southern California who lives her life with schizophrenia. And, she has the supports that she needs to be able to teach and do her writing, and interviewed lots of tech executives who have ADHD. And again, even 10 years ago, this was not really an open conversation. It was so stigmatized. It was a huge deal for anyone to talk openly about having ADHD. It was a huge deal to talk about depression, So just, again, a reminder of what a big departure this is from the last, several hundred years. So going back to sensitivity, so I looked at 5 sort of traits. When I started talking to people, I realized that a lot of people could relate to this experience of being so sensitive. So I looked at autism and ADHD. I looked at the highly sensitive person, which is not a diagnosis. It's sort of just a general personality trait that 20% of the population has. And that implies sensitivity in every way to light, to sounds, to the emotions of others, not feeling comfortable being watched or being rushed and things like that. In some ways has some parallel with being kind of like introspective, slightly more on the quiet side and things like that. And then I looked at sensory processing disorder, SPD for short, which is a form of sensitivity that has a lot to do with like the physical, like textures and the feeling of clothes on your skin. And it's most often noticed in children, of course, because kids are very vocal. Oh, this is too itchy, I don't want to wear that sweater and that kind of thing. But the fact is that, you know, these kids become adults and adults can still have SPD. And that's, again, the focus of this book is very much on adults. And then finally, I looked at synesthesia, which is this very interesting trait where people's senses get crossed. And so people will see colors with numbers or colors with words. And I focused on something called mirror touch synesthesia, which is when you literally feel what other people feel. And this has been scientifically documented. In fact, a friend of mine, Joel Salinas, wrote a great book called Mirror Touch, and he's like a Harvard neurologist. So with synesthesia, mirror touch synesthesia, if someone is scratching their cheek, like you will kind of feel that on your cheek. If someone's feeling very sad, you will feel very sad. And Joel, again, he was trained in neurology and spent time with psychiatric patients and had to really learn how to function sitting in a room with someone who was really going through a lot emotionally. So those are the 5 traits: autism and ADHD, synesthesia, SPD, and the highly sensitive person. And I felt it was important to call attention to this because the more I talk to people, the more I realize that a lot of people can relate to this. And even normalizing sensitivity was kind of a big deal, even 5 years ago. I think especially like in the US context, you know, we're supposed to be tough and go and productive, and of course that conversation has changed with, you know, conversations around wellness and mindfulness and that kind of thing. But again, it is a very radical departure for human beings to start to be so open about their inner lives and for it not to be stigmatized. That's such a huge revolution in our larger culture. So going beyond the 5 traits, when we think about neurodiversity at work or neurodiversity at school, neurodiversity in our families, there's been so much progress, so much innovation. As I mentioned, I talked to a lot of tech executives with ADHD. A very senior person at Adobe came forward as having ADHD and dyslexia. Their kids also have ADHD and dyslexia. Of course, Elon Musk has shared openly that he's on the spectrum. You just start to see it everywhere if you start to really pay attention. I'll share a brief passage. Embracing neurodiversity at work allows for a narrative shift to happen because colleagues find themselves surprised by the mismatch between what they think a neurodivergence might look like and how it actually shows up in a person. It is essential that all workplaces, companies, organizations, nonprofits, government offices open up this Pandora's box so that the buried treasures and gifts that neurodivergent folks possess can emerge and help entire teams. Senior executives, managers, bosses, board members, and others have a significant role to play in creating work cultures and spaces that allow for the language of neurodiversity. This can have a profound ripple effect throughout companies and society at large. the opportunity to transform social norms is real and tangible. So what I've seen in the larger, culture, the climate, is that as this becomes normalized, as it becomes less stigmatized, people are very comfortable to be open about who they are. And so the pressure to perform, to mask, as we call it, becomes less and less. So it's very exciting. I'm sure that you can think of examples in your own life. How many people hearing all this, have people who come to mind that you're like, oh, they're probably neurodivergent. This is really helping me understand them? Yeah, okay, maybe close to half. That's cool. And so, in terms of the future, now that this is becoming like a thing, and most people have heard about neurodiversity, one of the things that I've been focused on that I think about a lot, we've started to implement sort of interventions and accommodations and policies. A lot of companies have a quiet room, or what they call a sensory room. People are often offered headphones, if they're overstimulated. Even some airports, basketball stadiums sometimes have these quiet rooms. And these are all fantastic, and I think that's only going to grow. What I think a lot about as a journalist, as someone who thinks about words all day long and language and how we use these words, along the lines of sensitivity, I've just come to realize that one of the incredible gifts that so many neurodivergent people have is the quality of being a very deep thinker. And again, I think that this historically has been somewhat stigmatized, you're not supposed to overthink, you're just supposed to kind of follow the rules. You're supposed to just do what everyone is doing. You're not supposed to question. And that's really tough for neurodivergent people. Many neurodivergent people have a very, very strong sense of justice and a very, very strong sense of not going along with the group, not going along with a crowd. So in a lot of my recent work and thinking, and I have a new book coming out next year on this topic, is really about what do we do with that? Beyond the sensory room, beyond the headphones. How do we change the narrative around what it means to be a deep thinker? And how do we create a culture shift where asking questions is this really awesome thing, where somebody who loves to think deeply is really welcome on the team, where the person who thinks so deeply is looked up to for their critical thinking skills. So I've been thinking about this a lot, largely because of our political climate and because social media just really polarizes people. The world is kind of desperate for this right now. And so this is another area in which I believe that many neurodivergent people will soon be very appreciated for this quality. Again, it's something that has been stigmatized. I'll read another brief passage because sometimes this quality is referred to as giftedness. There's a whole area of study, around gifted studies. Again, this is often in the context of education, a gifted and talented student will be identified and it's discussed in academic terms, but the scholarly work around giftedness goes so much deeper than academic accomplishments. It's so much about the quality of perceptiveness, not being afraid to ask questions, and being so finely attuned to your own inner world and your sense of things that it's virtually impossible to go along with a crowd. And if you think about our climate right now, that's what we need more of, right? Being able to stay true to your values. The word gifted conjures up images of little Einsteins, but in fact, the psychological study of giftedness has focused on a whole personality profile of gifted and talented individuals. and high sensitivity is often a part of it. There is also the term asynchronous development, which refers to exceptional growth and talent in some areas of life or study, but delay in others. For some, this may be more along the lines of what's called twice exceptional, where a person experiences both giftedness and autism or ADHD or dyslexia, for example. I think, this is a quote, I think part of giftedness is taking in a lot of information and then thinking about what to do with that information. Grace Maloney says, she's a therapist in California. Quote, it's a form of asynchronous development, end quote, because the individuals are far ahead of their peers. Quote, but they may be more developed in some areas and also less developed in some areas. And often less development has to do with social coping. And there can be overlap with high sensitivity, gifted, and autistic. So we want to help them understand their traits, end quote. Regulating emotions is sometimes challenging, says Maloney. A person may say something negative, and the sensitive, gifted, or neurodivergent person will react defensively to the comment and may even scream or get into a rage. So then there is a behavior challenge, which makes a boss, partner, parent, or teacher respond with a negative consequence. Quote, if you treat this behaviorally, you're not going to get to the root problem, which is understanding, Maloney says. Intellectual explanations for why a misunderstanding has occurred or why feelings are hurt often work more successfully because there is a deep need and craving to understand the why of a situation. So I share that to shed more light about the neurodivergent experience, the experience of someone who's sensitive, and again, to paint the picture of how these traits have been historically pathologized. And you kind of get this picture like, oh, wait a second. The people who ask questions, the people who are sensitive, the people who feel a lot, they're the ones who are stigmatized, ostracized, marginalized, and it starts to feel like we have it all backwards. Like that's what we need more of in the world. So I'll conclude there. I want to thank you all so much for being here, for listening. I hope this has had an impact. Funny enough, I tend to write a lot about this stuff on Instagram, of all places. You can find me there. I love hearing from people. It's just a positive environment to share. And most of all, it's just so uniting to realize that there's so many other people out there often having very similar thoughts. And I hope some of you feel that way here tonight. I hope you feel seen, heard, understood. And I'm looking forward to your questions. Please ask whatever you'd like. And thank you again.
All right, so we're actually going to move on to a little Q&A where I will be sitting and chatting, and then we will open it up to the audience afterwards. All right, is this on? Okay, good.
Yep.
This is we're surviving the tech stuff today, so I'll take it. So first of all, thank you for that wonderful, wonderful presentation. Even if I was just in the back hearing it and getting to fan about it. So I do want to start by opening up about your book. So you have so much great information in your book. If I could just dissect every piece and make a million notes, I would. And I want to know, how was the experience of writing Divergent Minds for you, and what impact, if any, has that had on you?
Thank you. Great question. I think for me, writing is a healing act. It's very therapeutic. It's, cathartic. It's just the way I process the world. I think, if you take in a lot of information and you're just like full of so many thoughts and ideas, you have to release that somehow. And for some people, it's art, music, sports, running. for me, it happens to be writing, and some of that has to do with the fact that the writing leads to conversation, and being able to keep digesting ideas with other people is one of the most rewarding things about this job.
Fantastic. I love it. And I also want to ask, like, as we know that at least I feel there's more and more conversation about this term, neurodivergence. It's more of a becoming slightly mainstream. I say the word and people aren't always like, what are you talking about? So with it becoming a little more mainstream, with it becoming, there's more conversations such as those around your book, how do you feel things have changed regarding neurodivergence and our understanding, as well as what are potentially some common misconceptions that folks still have about neurodivergence?
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying, I think the term has become pretty mainstream. I mean, I see it like all over LinkedIn, and it's just like everywhere. I do think there's this issue of like people thinking that it's a synonym only for autism and ADHD. That's just so like limiting. Again, it's neurological diversity, so why would it be reduced to only like 2 traits? I also think there needs to be discussion about like diagnosis versus not diagnosing, and I personally am like completely agnostic about that. I don't think you need to go an official diagnosis route. I think if you just need to know that there's other people out there like you, great, like just leave it at that, but if you need it for accommodations at work or school, then go that route too. So those are some things I think about.
Yeah, I like the piece of finding what works for each individual, because I think can happen very often where it's that piece of here's the one answer, and as we know, there is no one answer in life. If there was, things would be a lot easier. So in your book, you point mostly to women, especially women who have been diagnosed later on. So can you explain a little more about, either in your experience or the experience of the folks you've talked with, what that late diagnosis impact really has been like for folks, and just potential things that come with that?
Definitely. Yeah. So because so much research and attention has been on young boys, girls, women, non-binary, trans folks have sort of been left out of the equation a lot of the time. Until the 1990s, it wasn't even required to have like gender diversity in your research samples. And it takes so long, about like 20 years, for research findings to really be implemented on a wide scale. So the idea is basically, because girls and women are largely socialized to kind of blend in, pick up on social cues, that they've been flying under the radar, or they camouflage, or they're masking. So the idea is that there are a lot of women and girls who are really suffering, and they might be quiet, they might kind of space out during class. There's a lot of like internal emotional intensity that doesn't really get fleshed out until much later. So now the conversation has changed. I think there's so much more awareness. Many women are referred to as like a lost generation of women. Clinicians are very aware of this. I do think we're at risk of like overdiagnosing, though, like overcorrecting. Like not all of this has to fit into autism or ADHD. And, I think we're at risk of sort of making it like a trendy thing. And, again, like do whatever you need to do. But I don't think the goal or the idea is to like go find a box that you belong into, right? Like I think it's more about self-understanding. So, yeah.
Yeah, that piece of what feels right for you. And I appreciate that you brought up the element of like it doesn't have to be a neurodiversity thing, because I think for folks who may not have read the book, even if you yourself were like, I don't really connect with neurodivergence, I don't think that's me, I think there's still elements in your book that not only help us understand neurodivergence, but is like, oh, I kind of do that too. Not on the same level, like the piece of about sensory stuff. I'm not always like, not everything bothers me, but it's like if I have to put gloves on, my hands are a little bit like, I don't love it. And whether that's a neurodivergence thing or not, it doesn't really matter to me because it's only the gloves. So I just find better gloves. So I think there's so many different ways that people can connect with the book, and I love that. The other piece, as we're talking about, your book's about women, do you feel, because you mentioned non-binary, that research is also moving into looking sort of beyond just men and women when it comes to this topic? Or is it still, there's a lot more growth to go?
That's a great question. I think we're at a pretty good place with this, actually, and I don't have like the current stats or numbers, but there's definitely a pretty established link between, if you are on the autism spectrum, for example, to not feel compelled to box yourself in an inauthentic way, right? So there seems to be a lot more openness to different forms of gender expression, I will say, right? And so, I do see a lot out there right now in terms of like some kind of link between the trans and autistic experience. I don't know what the numbers are, but we certainly see and hear about it a lot right now. And to be honest, like clinicians and therapists are very influenced by the larger conversation, what's happening in pop culture, what's happening in social media. And so they're paying attention to what people are thinking about as expressed online, if that makes sense.
Yes, that piece of like, because it's, again, coming more mainstream, those conversations are happening to begin with, we're paying attention and able to take that as part of the work we do. In this whole conversation about neurodivergence, we're talking a lot about individuals' experience, especially in this book, what neurodivergence is. What are elements about neurodivergence that you wish individuals could understand that maybe wasn't brought up in the book or is not part of that larger conversation?
Larger aspects of neurodivergence, like the experience of being neurodivergent, or?
Yeah, something like that, or elements that you feel are usually not significant enough to be brought up sometimes, that or something that folks overlook, but you feel either in your own experience or in the experience of others is important for people to understand.
Mm-hmm. I think like the interesting aspect of neurodivergence is that it varies so much. So you can't really like pinpoint one thing. Like for some people, the sensory thing is such an overwhelming thing, and that defines their experience of neurodivergence, and it's a huge topic for them to bring up at work, and they're so light sensitive or they're so sound sensitive, for example. For other people, it might be so extremely important to have like a preview of things. So like before going into a meeting, to like know what the agenda is, to know what the steps are. Like even for myself, this is so funny, but when we moved, my husband like literally took me on a tour of Costco so that I like was familiar and knew what to expect, because I was really intimidated going into a huge big box store with like the lights and everything. But it was so helpful. It was like I got the steps, I got the preview, and then I was good to go. But I don't always remember that, And so like when I have to switch into work mode, I feel kind of awkward requesting for all the info up front because it doesn't seem to be common practice. Like to me, that's normal. So anyways, just to say like it varies for every person. So I can't really pinpoint like one thing that I think needs more attention.
Yeah. I love the piece about Costco, because as someone who like has always been high anxiety, has struggled with anxiety my whole life, I'm like, that speaks to me of the like, please walk me through the space before I have to do it solo, so I know exactly what to expect. I was the kid that was like, my school map, I was like, okay, first day of school, I'm going to go here and then here and then here, and I'll be good to go. So yeah, again, that piece of like connecting to neurodivergence way that, maybe not be neurodivergence itself is just really fascinating to me. So along with that talk of, maybe needing that preview of a space, when it comes to neurodivergence, there are, struggles because, as we said, I'll ask for something in advance and it's just not common practice for folks. So what is some advice that you would give to individuals who, especially those who have recently come to terms or an understanding of their neurodivergence when it comes to neurodivergence in the workplace or just in general?
What advice do I have for people who are new to all this?
Yeah.
I mean, so I have to think back to the beginning of my journey because it was so overwhelming. I mean, I think it's definitely important to take it slow, take your time. I think by nature, a lot of neurodivergent people are very intense researchers. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of you have already dug into all this and gone down all the rabbit holes and know everything. So that's awesome. Congrats. But the processing and internalizing of all that takes time, right? And implementing it into your own self-awareness, self-understanding, and then figuring out how to talk to other people about it, right? And to explain it to your family members, your loved ones. That's a whole other conversation because you kind of have to translate it. It's oh, remember that time that this thing happened? Oh, actually, it was because of this, So I think taking your time, being patient with yourself, taking it slow, at the same time, giving yourself permission to also feel relief, excitement, gratitude, because it's ultimately very healing to finally have a better understanding of yourself. So.
Perfect. I love it. Additionally, so again, we talked about neurodivergence being more of a spectrum that everyone experiences it different. And there's, I think, a lot of folks who are neurodivergent, especially in workplace settings, that what they need is very different than the mainstream. So often that can lead to burnout and fatigue. So what advice or sort of any information you would give regarding how to manage that burnout or what that burnout can look like for neurodivergent folks?
Yeah, this is a really important topic because I think obviously the topic of burnout is a huge topic across the board, not just for neurodivergent people. And one thing I just want to point out though is there does seem to be a lot of overlap between autoimmune challenges and neurodivergent people. That's been pretty well established. So there's not a lot out there on this yet. I'm sure researchers are on this, but it's just something to be aware of, because there could be underlying physical issues there, right? So I don't have a great answer for this one because I just think this is a systemic issue, right? I mean...
Yeah, it's the burnout is a bigger conversation that's not affecting just one group. It's taking care of yourself, all those pieces, which is really hard, especially when we're sometimes put in work environments that are go, go, go.
Exactly. And I just think it's our whole culture just kind of runs on burnout and it's kind of designed that way, So that's a larger who's ready to change the entire US culture?
Yeah,
something like that. So, yeah, I mean, I think all the usual stuff applies. Get enough sleep, make sure you are eating well and all of that. So, yeah, I don't know. I haven't cracked that one yet.
Also, that part about neurodivergence and autoimmune, being connected is so fascinating to me as someone who has autoimmune disorder and never heard of that. And I feel like I want to learn more about that, have some conversations, because just one on its own, as someone who is constantly sick because of autoimmune disorder, I can't imagine combining both, what that looks like. So it's fascinating.
Yep.
And as we keep learning more and doing more, what do you think the future of sort of neurodivergence looks like?
Do you mean the way we implement neurodiversity informed policies, or the philosophical conversation? Which angle?
Let's do philosophical conversation.
Love it. Yeah. The future of neurodiversity. Okay, so I think all movements are at risk of becoming very tribal, very divisive, very dogmatic, and full of jargon. So I'm not sure what the future of neurodiversity is. I think it's a great term. I think it's really helped people. And I love that it's still like spreading like wildfire. I just think that we also have to be careful, and we have to think about what purpose it's serving and who it's serving, and to make sure that it's always contributing in a positive, healthy way. Because unfortunately, the pairing of any movement with social media just starts to create this kind of polarizing effect and tribal effects. And again, this is the topic of my next book. So I just think we have to be careful, because something that started out as so positive and so hopeful, we have to be careful, and we don't want it to become another way in which we box ourselves in. So I often talk about identity and the way that we categorize ourselves as kind of temporary passageways. I think for many people, no matter what identity box you fit yourself into, it's so important, especially in the beginning phases. Like, I think people really lean in, and they're excited, and it's a way of really getting to know yourself better. But I think ultimately that can and does give way to some kind of larger sense of belonging and having a sense of common humanity. And so that is my hope ultimately for the neurodiversity space, is that this stuff does become so normalized that we don't actually need all these words, and we don't need the names, and we don't need the categories. And I think that's the goal of a lot of these types of movements. And we're just not there yet, right? This is really new for a lot of people. And so we're in that phase of its historical evolution where it's still this exciting new thing. So it's difficult to predict where it's going to go, but that would be my hope.
Yeah. I love the idea of like it being like a temporary passageway, because I think for being LGBT, that like connects a lot to that kind of discovery as well, and different kind of, for anyone that's had to try to think of like, what does this mean about me? Like, what label or identity do I need one? Having that freedom to be like, I'll just take what works for me in this moment. And as the language develops, as I develop, I can, travel through to another one. So I just think it's a beautiful idea. So for individuals who are in this space, or just in general who are not neurodivergent, what advice do you have for how to support folks who are neurodivergent in their lives?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I do hear from a lot of people who've picked up the book, and they say it's been so helpful for understanding their daughter or son, or anybody really, sister, uncle, whomever, or their patients. I hear from a lot of therapists. So I think, again, the listening piece, the showing empathy, validating people where they are, what their actual internal experience has been, is so important. I think allowing yourself to be open to move away from that historical way of looking at the mind that I talked about earlier, not seeing things in terms of normal and abnormal, and sort of letting your own understanding evolve. That itself can be very, very healing for other people, because then people in your presence, in your company, know that they're not being looked at in a strange way. They know that they're not being stigmatized in your own eyes. So I think that's the ultimate thing, right? Is just acceptance.
Right. Just be the safe person in the safe space for them to be them. Yeah. Easiest step we can all take. So my last question for you is, what types of resources, tools, programs, or anything like that do you find has been helpful for you or others who are neurodivergent, and might be helpful for folks who are, again, in that period of starting their journey with neurodivergence?
Yeah, this again kind of goes back to like how different every person is. So for me, the main thing in my life that's helpful is having a lot of quiet time and spending a lot of time in nature. So that's, I would say, my biggest like intervention. I grew up in a big city. I was actually pretty extroverted as a kid. I come from a big family. But again, my family was all like pretty sensitive and understanding. So I didn't need to escape or, so I think it's different for every person. Again, going back to the headphones can be so helpful for a kid in school to just drown out all the noise and just focus on their work. Working from home was, used to be a huge like accommodation request. Now it's pretty normal. So it's usually little tweaks like that can just have a really big impact on a neurodivergent person's comfort and sense of ease in the world. For myself, again, it's just a lot of quiet, a lot of nature. That just helps me stay pretty regulated. So, yeah.
Perfect. I'm also a big fan of the nature until a spider comes involved, and then I will run away.